So it's my pleasure, if the panel is close by and ready, to introduce my old friend, Senator Pa Wu. Senator Wu is been in the Senate for some time, and this panel will deal with the 2030 challenge, transitioning Canada's industrial economy. And if the panelists are ready, and Senator Wu, if you're ready, welcome to the stage.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. As you've heard, I'm Yuen Wu, Senator for British Columbia. My great pleasure to be moderating the session. But as the Senator for British Columbia, let me take the opportunity to welcome those of you who've come from afar to this province, and particularly to this corner of paradise on Vancouver Island. The stage has been set quite nicely for this panel, which has the somewhat grandiose title of Transitioning Canada's Industrial Economy. This is, of course, a topic that is front of mind in Ottawa, and particularly with the new government. But I think it might be fair to say that we're not exactly clear what we are transitioning, where we are transitioning to, and what we are transitioning for. And certainly in the context of the discussions we've had yesterday and today on the SDGs, and particularly on climate actions, both 2030 and 2050 targets, I've not heard a lot from the current government about a transition of Canada's economy towards those ends, if we can put it that way. Now, the 2030 target, as you all know, is an SDG target for the 17 SDGs. It's also an interim target for our net zero objective. Net zero is supposed to be 2035, correct? But the 2050, I'm sorry, but 2030 is the interim target, by which time we're supposed to have reduced emissions 40% below the 2005 levels. You may recall from the earlier presentation from the Auditor General, the Commissioner of Sustainable Development and Environment, their latest report has found us wanting on that interim target. For us to be able to catch up will require a lot of work indeed. And we have a panel to help us think through how we might do that. Not just the environment targets, but the broader question of transitioning Canada's industrial economy. You have the bios of our speakers in your program, so I won't go into much introduction, but I'm going to invite, first of all, our speaker, Dan Woynillowicz, to kick us off. Dan is an advisor to BC's CleanBC strategy. He's reviewing it and coming up with new ideas. So I'm going to ask him to set the stage for where he thinks we are in our 2030 and 2050 targets, and tell us what he thinks the problem is we need to solve. So Dan, over to you.
Great, thank you. So I think in order to be able to do this, we have to start by rewinding a decade. 2015, world leaders congregate in Paris for the international climate negotiations that led to the Paris Agreement. I think in retrospect now, it was perhaps a somewhat simpler time. We had President Obama showing up, working with President Xi from China. We had Chancellor Angela Merkel from Germany was wrestling President Vladimir Putin into the Paris Agreement. And we had a newly minted Prime Minister from Canada, Justin Trudeau, who went to Paris and brought premiers with him. And there were numerous selfies of the Prime Minister with premiers smiling together about global climate action and Canada's place in that. And I think it's also useful to look at what were the principles that underpinned Canada's negotiating stance in Paris, and that have really underpinned everything we've seen from the federal government from a climate policy perspective. So I'm just going to go through them. So the first principle was to act based on the best scientific evidence and advice. Second is that Canada will support and implement policies that contribute to a low carbon economy. Third, Canada will work with provinces, territories, cities, and Indigenous leaders. Fourth, Canada will help the developing world tackle the challenges of climate change. And fifth, and perhaps most germane to the conversation this morning, Canada views climate change not just as a challenge, but as an historic opportunity to build a sustainable economy. So if we then come back from Paris and we go into a series of new laws and regulations that were put into place by the federal government, ranging from putting a price on carbon pollution, both for consumers and for industry. Of course, that consumer price is now gone. The clean fuel regulations, the EV availability standard, myriad programs incentivizing individuals and industries to adopt cleaner technologies, from electric vehicles to heat pumps to carbon capture and storage. And we also saw both the federal and provincial governments make their first forays into industrial policy, or something that they were characterizing as industrial policy, and that applied to everything from hydrogen to critical minerals, but I think most pointedly a focus on the EV battery supply chain and the prospects for Canada to be an EV manufacturer. And over that period of time, and in no small part because of these policies and programs, we have seen Canada's greenhouse gas emissions decline. We're at about 8.5% below 2005. That's about a 65 million ton reduction. That was where we were at in 2023. So it's not yet enough to be on track for our 2030 target, but it is putting us on the right kind of a trajectory, if we stick with it, to achieve net zero by 2050. Now, over that same period of time, the past 10 years, we also had quite a few disruptors. We had a global pandemic. We had the first iteration of a Trump presidency. We had Russia invade Ukraine, which had a cascading impact into energy markets and prices of oil and gas, which drove a whole new development cycle of oil and gas, but also a very different outlook for what it means to have secure energy, not just in Europe, but also in Asia. And I think one of the things that's become abundantly clear is that achieving net zero by 2050 is actually about energy transformation. About 80% of global emissions come from how we produce and use energy. So if we're going to achieve that outcome, we're going to have to transform how we produce and use energy. And in that respect, we're actually doing reasonably well, and perhaps better than many of us had anticipated. And I think a good marker for that is to actually just follow the money. And so what we see is that over the past 10 years, renewable investment is up 109%. Grids and storage investment is up 44%. Energy efficiency, 42%. Technologies that help us electrify are up 131%. And over that same period, investment in oil dropped 34% and investment in gas dropped 19%. There's still some stubborn investment in coal, but the trajectory for fossil fuels relative to clean energy is clear. In every year since 2016, investment in clean energy has exceeded the annual investment in fossil fuels. And last year, you can applaud that, that's good news. And last year, for every dollar that was invested in fossil fuels, $2 were invested in clean energy. So we have to recall that some of this it's a question of stocks versus flow. We still have a large existing stock of fossil energy in the system and in various technologies that combust fossil fuels. But when we look at the flows, where is capital flowing? It's flowing into clean energy and clean energy technologies. And we're beginning to see the results from that, of course, in China most acutely. So here we are now in 2025, Trump 2.0, and this is very different than Trump 1.0. Yes, he did the same thing he did before, which was exit the Paris Agreement, but this time he was able to actually fundamentally undermine how America had been trying to position itself from an industrial strategy and from an energy transition perspective. So the Inflation Reduction Act and its myriad supports for not only deploying clean energy in the United States, but trying to build up domestic manufacturing capacity, also creating opportunities for Canada, that's largely going to be undone. And so in light of all of that, I think if we, read the newspapers here in Canada, or if you go on LinkedIn or other social media platforms, the outlook we have right now for energy transition in North America and in Europe, it feels pretty negative. And yet, despite all that, when we look at what's happening everywhere else still in the global south, in China, in those places where energy demand is increasing the fastest, it's still a good news story. And I think part of it is within North America and in Europe, so much of that energy transition and that experience we've had was centered on net zero and trying to reduce emissions. And so now, when that's no longer the flavor of the day, it's, if we look at where climate change stacks up in public opinion in terms of priorities, it's further down the list, usually number 5 or number 6 in terms of issues of concern for Canadians. But for the global south, and for China especially, they look at energy transition not just through the lens of net zero. In fact, for most of them, the primary driver is energy security. What does it look like to become less dependent on importing fossil fuels and less at risk of the volatility that accompanies dependence on those fossil fuels? And we've really seen, I think, as everybody will recognize, that China has emerged as a unique actor, not just in terms of the scale at which they're deploying wind, solar, electric vehicles in China, but the extent to which they are dominating those supply chains and production of those technologies, not just for their own use, but for export. In particular, if we look again, countries in the global south, we look at Belt and Road, China is getting a very significant foothold in exporting those technologies to those markets as well. And what's emerging from all of this is the rise of what some call the electrostate and the risk to and potential decline of the petrostate. And there's a French energy analyst, Anne-Sophie Corbeau. She works at the Columbia Center on Global Energy Policy, and she I think, captured it quite succinctly. So I'm going to read a quote from her. So she writes, "What is emerging are two competing models of energy and influence, one anchored in the enduring logic of hydrocarbons, the other in the accelerating promise of electrification. At stake is not just the future of energy systems, but the contours of geopolitical power in the decades ahead." So I think that captures well what Prime Minister Carney keeps referring to as a hinge moment. And I think if we try to put this in perspective from a Canadian perspective, I think it's useful to think of it in this way. So right now, we're the 4th largest producer of oil in the world. We produce a little over 5 million barrels per day. By 2030, Bloomberg New Energy Finance projects that electric vehicles will be displacing 5.3 million barrels per day of oil. I'm not saying that Canada is just going to be singled out and we're no longer going to be able to produce and export oil, but to give you a sense of the scale and the speed at which this transition is now unfolding and having material impacts on oil and gas markets, I think needs to be paramount in our minds when we're thinking about projects of national significance, when we're thinking about what it looks like to reorient our economy through industrial strategy and through new trading relationships. And I think we're in a relatively unique situation in that we are a very significant producer and exporter of oil and gas, and we benefit significantly from it. But we also do have the building blocks to be able to compete and succeed in a more electrified future. We have the critical minerals that go into clean energy technologies. We have the clean energy resources and technologies to build out our electricity system in a massive way to power that economic activity and to reduce the dependence that we have on oil and gas in our own economy and the impacts that we experience when those prices spike, often because of geopolitical events that are well beyond our control. So electrostate, petrostate, we have the unique opportunity to choose, and what it means to make a choice is to successfully develop and deploy industrial strategy that leans into those areas where we have some unique comparative advantage and to double down on those. So I think I'm going to leave it there, and now we'll talk about what that industrial strategy looks like.
Yes, we will, but let me just summarize a little bit what you've said. It would seem to me that your interpretation of the session theme of the industrial transformation is the choice between an electrostate and a petrostate. You seem fairly optimistic that we are headed down the road of an electrostate. I'd like other panelists to take up that question and the audience to think a little bit about that as well, because what I'm seeing in Ottawa is relatively less discussion on the electrostate and much more on the petrostate, but we'll get back to that shortly. Our next panelist is Bentley Allan. He's been doing a lot of work on industrial strategy. Bentley, tell us if you agree with this priority of becoming more of an electro state, and tell us how you think industrial strategy might help us in that direction. Please.
Thank you so much, Senator, and thank you all for being here. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be at the Victoria Forum. I wanted to pick up on a story that Dan started with looking at the Paris Agreement, and I wanted to say that I think something really tangible changed after 2015 in the global climate conversation. And it wasn't because of the agreement that was put in place at Paris. If we look back at what the states of the world agreed to at Paris, they agreed to what we call a ratchet mechanism, which is basically we're going to set a target and then we're going to meet back here every 5 years and we're going to assess progress towards that target. And then we're going to set a more aggressive target the next time, we promise. And this ratchet mechanism was originally floated by the Japanese negotiators in 1990, and the Europeans laughed it out of the room. And they said, if we deploy a ratchet mechanism where we just say that we'll make an agreement and 5 years come back and review it, the world won't take us seriously. And yet in 2015, that exact same agreement was what was touted as progress on the global climate file, right? So something radical changed around 2015, but it wasn't because of a piece of paper that was signed in Paris. It was because of the radical cost reductions that were happening in solar and wind and batteries. And there was a question down here from the floor just at the end of the last panel, which said that, maybe the progress is not happening because of politics or social progress, but because of technological progress, right? But there's an implicit division right there between politics and technology, which I think the history, just looking at how we got here in climate, does not hold up, right? Those cost declines in solar and wind and batteries did not emerge from thin air. They emerged from explicit choices by the Chinese state to make a bid for scientific and technological leadership in a dangerous political world, right? So China, seeing the geopolitical writing on the wall, wanted to be a great power, wanted to lead an energy revolution because it looked at the experience of the British Empire and the American Empire, and it said, how do we get to be number one? We lead an energy revolution. We make ourselves indispensable to the global energy system, and that is how we will do it, right? And so what is driving climate action today is not a climate model. It's not free-flowing concern for trees and the bacteria in the bellies of the insects, which when folks cheered for technology winning in climate, I felt like jumping out of my seat and cheering for that bacteria on the previous panel. I was like, yeah, you get that dengue. But what is driving climate action today is less our concern for modeling or climate or even the forest fires that are affecting our air quality every day, and more the economic and geopolitical imperatives that we are seeing in a dangerous world. So I want to lay out, first of all, that I think here in Canada, we're facing three interlocking crises, right? The first is the climate crisis, and it's not going away, right? The forest fires are here, and they will be here. The extreme heat will be here. The extreme weather affecting folks in the tropics especially will be there. The possibility that the monsoon in India shuts down, leaving hundreds of millions of farmers without the rains that they need in order to feed one of the most population-dense regions in the world, that crisis is not going away, right? And we have to keep that crisis in mind, right? But at the same time, Trump's threats against Canada's economic and military sovereignty have raised a second crisis, that we have become far too dependent on the United States of America and the goodwill of whoever is sitting on Pennsylvania Avenue. And interlocking with that is Dan's comments raise a third crisis that we have not yet recognized as a crisis. We are a small, open economy in the formal parlance of international economics, and we are dependent on our exports. And our number one export, $190 billion last year, is fossil fuels. And as Dan has pointed out, It is no longer a question of if, but when that number starts to go down. And we are macroeconomically dependent on that number. So we are in the middle of a slow-burning economic crisis, and we're just not having a national conversation about it. Instead, the national project list probably will feature 4 or 5 projects which are meant to double down on our ability to export fossil fuels to other countries, right? So we're going to double down on our ability to export into markets with falling prices. It's not that our oil won't be purchased. It will be purchased. It'll just be purchased at $40 a barrel instead of $80 a barrel. And that actually, Cenovus is cool with. That, you know, some of the costs actually in the tar sands are quite low. They're very efficient producers globally, and so they will continue to survive on much smaller margins, right? But the question is whether or not the country will survive when its GDP takes the hit that it will take when that number goes from 190 to 100 and then maybe to 60 or maybe to $40 billion a year, right? So the imperative that we have as a small open economy that is dependent on its exports is how are we going to go down the rest of the export table and increase the exports that we have in critical minerals, in wood, in manufactured goods, in retailed goods, in the other products that make up the economic activity in this country, right? And so the good news actually here is that we can address all 3 of these crises at the same time, right? We can develop an industrial strategy that is designed to diversify our trade, that is designed to address the climate crisis by continuing and deepening the cost reductions that were initiated by Chinese industrial strategy, therefore making those technologies just plain economic sense. Again, we don't need to care about the climate in order to drive an electric vehicle at this point. It's just cheaper and better. It's a better experience, and it's just cheaper both in terms of the life of the vehicle, the maintenance costs and the fuel costs, but now starting this year, it's going to start to be cheaper on sticker price too, right? Just last week, Ford announced a new platform for electric trucks that they'll be introducing a $30,000 electric truck in 2027. So again, even in the belly of Trump's beast, Ford is continuing to press play on technological progress rather than go backwards on fossil fuels, right? And we can do all of this while we create geopolitical leverage, while we can make Canada's economy matter in the global economy, right? And we do that especially through critical minerals, right? This is the #1 geopolitical leverage point that China is able to exert currently. Trump just lost a trade negotiation with China. I mean, you wouldn't get that from reading the newspaper, but that's the reality. That is what happened. He threatened major tariffs on China, and China said, well, I'd like to see you make an F-35 without rare earth minerals. And he said, you got me. I'm going to drop the tariffs. Can those rare earths please flow again, right? Now, if we as a country, Canada, had taken the advice of some experts, some which may be on the stage, I don't know, maybe, and in 2018, really doubled down on a rare earths refining and extraction strategy, right? Instead of slow playing it, giving just enough money to make it say that we're doing something about it without actually doing anything about it. It's sort of a Canadian tradition. Then we would be in a position right now of immense geopolitical leverage. Every great power in the system that wants its automobile supply chains and its air fighter supply chains to continue to operate smoothly would want contracts with Canadian producers, right? Instead, we're back to square one. It's 2025, and we still have to say, wait, who's going to mine the rare earths, and where are we going to refine them, and how are we going to separate them properly? And the thing is, we have the expertise to do all of these things extremely well in this country. This plays into our competitive advantage. It plays into how we are going to develop economic opportunity in the energy transition, but we're just not attacking it with the amount of purpose that we need to attack it with, right? And so I think that there's actually a silver lining in the story that Dan is telling for climate policy in Canada. And in many ways, I think we put the cart before the horse. We put in place a stringent climate policy before we developed the economic interests that would be necessary to support that climate policy politically, right? So instead, the climate policy gets into political trouble. We're forced to fall back on economic motives for climate action. But that's okay, because we needed to build those economic motives in the first place. We needed to take them seriously, right? And now finally, we have some global geopolitical impulses that are pushing us to take those forces seriously, right? And we can respond with things that are win-win-win.
That's terrific, Bentley. I, it, I think what you're arguing is that the economic logic and the trajectory of the global economy should be driving the choices that we're making today for industrial transition, and those choices would almost automatically lead to more of an electro state than a petro state. But I have to tell you that this is not a conversation I'm hearing in Ottawa at all. To go back to Dan's initial comment on why China chose to go with the electro state trajectory, it was because they wanted energy security. It wasn't necessarily because of climate change objectives. And they wanted energy security because China is an energy deficient country when it comes to fossil fuels. So it makes a lot of logic. But Canada doesn't see itself that way. Canada sees itself as a fossil fuel abundant, a net exporter. And the voices of industry in this country that want to build on that natural comparative advantage are very, very strong. And on the geopolitical side, while China has a clear reason for going electric for geopolitical protection, the Canadian the discourse today is all about not offending our American neighbors even more and not incurring the wrath of higher tariffs. So the logic of much of what we're doing is really to align with American energy priorities, such as, for example, imposing 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs. Right? It's not done to protect a Canadian EV industry. It's to align with American objectives. So on that, I want to turn to Bill Lazonick, who lives in the US. He's Canadian, so is Bentley, all 4 Canadians here on this panel. Bill, you've studied the American economy very closely. You understand how it works. Tell us a bit about what it is we need to avoid when we try to protect our interests in the United States and how we can chart a path that's in Canada's interest.
Hey, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. Canada was my, might say, home and native land until 1968, when I, after completing my undergraduate degree at the University of Toronto, I departed to study economics in Europe. The same year, the Government of Canada published the report of the Task Force on the Structure of Canadian Industry, the Hopkins report, which documented an extremely high level of control of Canadian industry by US multinational corporations. As I left Canada at that point, I had no idea that I was embarking on an academic career in which the US business corporation would become my main area of expertise. That's what I'm going to talk about mostly today. Since 1970, when I entered a PhD program in economics at Harvard, I've done this work based in the United States. Over the intervening decades, the US corporate economy has changed substantially, including the rise of startups, global value chains, new global competitors, especially Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and China. Along the way, US corporations became infected with a socioeconomic disease, which I call predatory value extraction. Poisoned by the corporate governance ideology that I've been a long-time critic of, that a company should allocate its resources to maximize shareholder value. Canada needs to avoid this business model. Now I'll tell you why. Maybe some of you already know. Predatory value extraction occurs because public shareholders have the power to extract value from the corporation that is far in excess of their contributions to value creation. The antithesis of predatory value extraction is what I call progressive value creation, a system of corporate governance that seeks to ensure that distribution of the gains of value creation rewards households as workers and taxpayers commensurate with their contributions to the value creation process. Progressive value creation distributes value to workers who engage in the collective and cumulative learning that is the essence of the innovation process, as well as to taxpayers who fund government investments in knowledge and infrastructure, of which business corporations make use. Public shareholders, by contrast, just buy and sell outstanding shares. Yet the operation of the stock market can permit massive predation. An example, hedge fund activist Carl Icahn realized $2 billion US in 2016 to the sale of Apple shares that he had purchased on the stock market for $3.6 billion in 2013. Yet not 1 cent of that $3.6 billion went to Apple for investment in productive capabilities or any other purpose. He just bought and sold shares on the market. Not to be outdone, Warren Buffett, often known as a patient capitalist, used his control of Berkshire Hathaway to buy $39 billion US in Apple shares between 2016 and 2018. As of June 2024, Buffett had a net gain of $158 billion, yet not 1 cent of his original purchase of Apple shares, $39 billion, flowed to Apple. All Buffett did was buy and sell shares and cheerlead the next thing I'm going to talk about, which is the key to predatory value extraction, the repurchase of a corporation's own shares, also known as stock buybacks. Between 2013 and 2024, Apple used 91% of its very ample profits to repurchase $726 billion US in shares from the stock market, a massive manipulation of the company's stock price that enriched Icahn, Buffett, Tim Cook, Al Gore, who was on Apple's board, and many others. The company also paid about $157 billion, equal to in dollars, equal to about 20% of profits in dividends. Instead of buybacks, Apple could have increased the pay and enhanced the careers of the workers in its stores. It could have contributed to more to social causes. In response to the Black Lives Matter movement, Apple did put $200 million into a racial justice initiative in 2020-2023, but that contribution was only 0.06% of the amount that Apple wasted on buybacks during those years. Apple could have invested capital in critical technologies in its supply chain. For example, with a fraction of the amount spent on buybacks, Apple could have invested in a state-of-the-art semiconductor fab to manufacture its smartphone microprocessors. Instead, from 2007, Apple outsourced the fabrication of iPhone processors, first to Samsung, then to TSMC, Taiwan, putting these Asian companies to be, enabling them to become world leaders in advanced chip manufacture. Meanwhile, leading US fabricator, Intel, which is not much in the news lately, did $145 billion in buybacks from 1998 to 2021 and fell behind Samsung and TSMC. In 2021, the new CEO, Pat Gelsinger, said no more buybacks as he tried to implement an investment strategy to regain the lead in global competition. But Gelsinger was forced to resign December 2024 when Trump was elected as US president again. Now Trump has become directly involved with Intel, which is certainly the beginning of the end for this once iconic US company. Okay. Apple also has outsourced rechargeable batteries to South Korea and Korean and Chinese companies, enabling them to become global leaders in the EV transition. So it wasn't simply, though it was very important, the investments that the Chinese government made, but it was also the actions of American companies in the global value chains. The United States has no competitive EV battery makers, reflecting the financialization of the US chemical industry going back to the 1990s with lots and lots of buybacks. The plunder of the publicly listed corporation in the United States affects all industrial sectors. Pharma companies such as Merck and Pfizer say they need high drug prices to fund the next round of medicine innovation, yet spend in excess of 100% of their profits on distributions to shareholders. Boeing did $43 billion in buybacks from January 2013 to March 2019 as it sold unsafe planes. The second crash of the 737 MAX on March 10th, 2019 brought that market manipulation to an abrupt and tragic end. For the decade 2014-2023, S&P 500 index companies, largest companies in the United States, distributed $6.5 trillion US to buybacks. In buybacks, 50%, 6% of net income, and 4.9 trillion is dividends, another 41% of net income. By doing buybacks, companies that have been innovative throw away their competitive advantage, rewarding senior executives with their stock-based pay and hedge fund managers who count buybacks as money in the bank. In turn, the looting of the publicly listed corporation has funneled money into private equity, which plunders vulnerable firms, including in the United States, many in healthcare, with the dividend recapitalization as the value extracting analog to buybacks in publicly listed corporations. And under the second Trump administration, the United States has gone somewhat logically, and I think this is the subject of my next book, from the plundering of the corporation to the pillaging of the nation. Canada is not immune to the American disease of corporate financialization. For example, in 2009, 2010, faced by competition from Apple's iPhone, Research in Motion, BlackBerry, did $3 billion US in buybacks, as one of the founders sold a substantial portion of his shares. In 2022, Canadian supermarket chains, Loblaw, Metro, and Empire, did 2.3 billion Canadian in buybacks while they refused to continue pandemic hero pay to their employees. Buybacks by US big pharma companies, which continue to dominate drug sales in Canada, boost the prices that Canadians pay for medicines. I have a recent article on this, while denying Canada R&D commensurate with those sales. And remember Nortel, the manipulation and speculation that is accompanying the current AI mania will make the internet boom and bust, in which Nortel first rose and crashed and burned, look like the good old days. Thank you.
From plunder to pillage. That's a good line. Rather depressing, though. Bill, you started by saying that you're trying to make a plea for Canadian industry to not follow the American model, but it sounds like you think Canada is already mimicking the American model. Is that correct?
Well, it would be good to have a complete study of this, and I've never actually been able to get the funding to do a study. There is one sense in which I know Canada recently, and last year, 2 years ago, I think, mimicked the United States. Stupidly, the United States adopted a 1% tax on buybacks, which I argue just legitimized buybacks. You don't want the revenue. Canada imitated that with a 2% tax and thought they were doing something about the issue. But it's a problem. It's not as big a problem as it is in the United States, but that American disease spreads around the world. I've done a lot of studies of what's going on with financialization in Europe and in Asia as well.
Yes, well, maximizing shareholder value is a mantra here as it is in the United States. But let me ask you about the alternative, which you call progressive value creation. And my understanding of the way you've described it is that it's not simply the distribution of the gains more to labor rather than capital. It's also about the reinvestment of corporate profits into new industrial capacity, right? So workers may not necessarily benefit in the first instance, but it's about building the country's economic strength. So I want to open this question to you and to Bentley and to Dan as well, about the role of Canadian industrial policy, maybe along the lines of this progressive value creation, how that helps us do the transition of Canada's industrial economy to one that, I won't use the word electro-state, but I'll say that one is consistent with where the future is going, consistent with maximizing well-being and economic welfare for Canadians. Maybe I can start with Dan.
I think, so one thing just to lead off with is, I think if we look at the behavior of the Canadian oil and gas sector in recent years, where we've seen exactly this, we've seen much less of their wealth being reinvested back in capital investments in production. We're seeing a lot of buybacks. And I think we have to look at that in part as, what signal does that send in terms of the longer term confidence, recognizing that if they are to deploy capital, typically, especially for an oil sands project, you know, these need to be long-standing projects. These are not just, it's not like shale in the US where you make your capital outlay and you get your return within a couple of years. These are much longer, much more intensive projects to develop. And you know what we're hearing from the oil and gas sector right now is, to the extent that they're going to deploy capital in Canada, they need public dollars to do that. And for a while, it was just that they needed public dollars if they were going to do good things like reduce emissions by investing in carbon capture and storage. But now we're hearing that there need to be public dollars to just even facilitate their expansion and access to new markets. We ended up with a publicly owned pipeline, and when there are conversations about additional pipelines, there isn't private sector interest in that unless there's going to be a role for public dollars as well. So I think we need to look at that for the signal it's sending in terms of their own confidence in the long-term viability of their current business model. There have been a number of commentators who have looked at what's been happening, not just with Canadian oil and gas companies, but with the majors as well, and said, this is what you would do from a business strategy perspective to manage decline. This is not a sunrise industry, it's a sunset industry. And yet, to Bentley's point, this isn't a conversation that we're having in Canada. And so I think if we are going to be thinking about the economy and what's next, we actually have to think about what's next. And that means not doubling down on something that, yes, has been very beneficial to the country, but is not going to take us to where we need to be.
Yet the conversation around what we call projects of national interest, many of you know, we passed a bill just a couple of months ago to set up this new body. Much of that conversation is around how we build an east-west pipeline. And even if it's not economic viable from a private sector perspective, there should be some government support for it to happen. But you're saying that would be the wrong application of what Professor Lazonick calls progressive value creation.
I think we have to acknowledge that we only have so much in the way of both public dollars, but even just when it comes to making policy and just the mind share of our political leaders. And there's an opportunity cost. When we do one thing, we can't necessarily do another thing. And I think that's where there are these trade-offs. Some of the other projects of national significance that we're hearing about are offshore wind in Atlantic Canada and more east-west electricity transmission. Those aren't getting as much attention because they don't have the same kind of incumbent force and they don't have the same presence in the economy today. Oftentimes it's Crown-owned utilities. So it's a very different conversation in Ottawa based on who's showing up in Ottawa and lobbying for what ought to be the priorities for the government of the day.
That's an important word, the incumbent force. I want to turn to Bentley now and talk about the opportunity costs and the alternative use of government funds and other, let's call it surplus capital, to invest in the things of the future. Industrial strategy, in other words. I mean, we are dipping our toe into this area. As you know, we've put large sums of money into EV battery type projects in this country. Quite a few of them have failed already. You know, I think about Northvolt, of course, Stellantis is having trouble. The Ford project apparently is on the skid. Samsung is having trouble as well. Bentley, can we do this right? I mean, was it a mistake to try and invest in these battery facilities, which seem to be going south? And how could we have done it better?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I would just say overall, my perspective is not that we lack the capital necessary to do this properly. I just think we're not allocating it efficiently or effectively, to be perfectly honest with you. And I think that the battery factories are a great case in point, right? This was a reactive decision that was made, right? The IRA was passed in August of 2022, and immediately the project proponents, which wanted to already do battery factories in Canada, you know, knocked on the door of the PMO and said, well, it's going to cost you about what the IRA would pay us to put it in New York. So can you cut a check for that? And again, we did not have a public conversation about this. We did not have a public conversation about the sticker price, right? Or even how the tax credits were structured. And people don't even know, right? Does anybody know? How much are we spend? How much were we slated to spend on 3 battery factories? Anybody know?
At least.
1.6, way too low. Anybody want to guess? 45 is just a little high. It's about $40 billion, actually. If you do the math to match the production of those battery factories to the IRA, you would end up with about 40 billion based on the stated production. But the thing is that it's based on how much batteries actually get produced, right? So again, there was a newspaper article out a couple of weeks ago that said we had outlaid 40 billion on the, no, we haven't actually outlaid anything because it's indexed to production, right? So we can't even have an intelligent conversation about what our subsidy was, let alone make an intelligent decision about whether or not it was a good subsidy in the first instance, right? And in many ways, we're doing the exact same thing right now. The Carney government has announced $1 billion for the steel and the aluminum industry, a special supplement to the Strategic Innovation Fund. And if you look at the spending in the Strategic Innovation Fund, I would press any one of you to find something either strategic or innovative that the Strategic Innovation Fund has spent money on, including in, go ahead.
And yet they did that. So let's talk about the real politics of
They
this, right?
signaled to the industry, we're going to subsidize you before we have any clue what you're going to ask us for or what we would want for that money, right? So we have $1 billion that we've put on the table, and we've just said to the steel and the aluminum companies, come and lobby for this. We don't have any strings or strategy attached to it. Here's $1 billion.
Tell us about a good way to do industrial policy that points us in the right direction.
Absolutely. I'm glad you asked. Do you know anyone in Ottawa?
Oh, yes.
So just on steel, for instance, right? Again, let's take a 2050 perspective, right? What's the global economy going to look like in 2050? And what role do we think Canada should play in a global 2050 steel industry, right? So there's an idea, maybe, that we'll still be making a lot of steel with met coke and raw iron in 2050. That's the way that we do it now. We bring metallurgical coal, some of it from here in our beautiful BC mountains.
Okay.
And we combine it with raw iron, some of which comes from Quebec. And we put it in a blast furnace and we make steel. That's like 150 years we've been doing that, right? How many industries do you know that are 150 years old that aren't primed for disruption? The steel industry is ready to be redone, and we have technologies that are being developed in every other country except Canada that will revolutionize the way that we make steel. In the United States, electrolysis is becoming commercially viable, which is a way of making metal by charging electricity through those elements instead of lighting them on fire. So you can already imagine there's way less emissions because you're not lighting anything on fire. You're running electricity through it. Oh, and that electricity could be clean. Yeah, okay, well now we're starting to get somewhere. It'll be way cheaper to make steel through electrolysis, way cheaper, right? And we could do it really well because we have access to a lot of clean energy and we have a lot of untapped clean energy resources, right? So if energy becomes the #1 input into electrolytic steel, then we could have an important comparative advantage. But in order to do that, we need to position ourselves now. And not just by having a foreign company come in and do FDI for an electrolysis pilot, right? But by building up the expertise in the surrounding ecosystem that will be necessary to produce intellectual property and the technology basis that those companies will want to use and that other countries will want to use when they go to make electrolytic steel, right? So taking an innovation mindset to knowing where the puck is going and taking an innovation mindset to building the underlying aspects of the ecosystem that will feed into that global industry. We don't know what our niche in a global electrolytic steel industry could be, but we know that we have an opportunity there, right? Now that's just the electrolytic pathway, right? Currently, the most commercially viable pathway for making green steel is what's called direct reduced iron electric arc furnace. And if you'd like to learn more about that, I'm starting my lectures at Johns Hopkins next week. You're welcome to come on down and sit in with the 18-year-olds. But in DRI-EAF, you do a lot more value add to the iron before it arrives at the mill, right? So think of it this way. Instead of sending raw iron and raw coke to the mill, where it's then transformed into something much more valuable, you add a lot more value to the iron before it arrives there. And I've already told you we have incredibly good quality iron reserves. And it turns out you can reduce that iron using hydrogen and other things that we could also produce, right? So we could add a lot more value to iron for the steel that we make here in Canada in the DRI-EAF process, but we could also become an exporter of DRI and HBI and other value-added iron products, right? So again, I mean, I'm just thinking about this for 5 minutes right now. We're coming up with a strategic approach to how we position the Canadian steel industry in a future in which technological innovation will continue to happen, right? But instead what we did is we gave ArcelorMittal $300 million to make a business decision. It installed the same facility that it installed in Hamilton in Corpus Christi with zero public dollars, and we paid them for the pleasure of doing the same thing in Hamilton. We gave them old technology that we subsidized with our Strategic Innovation Fund. We're not taking a strategic approach.
Well, as it turns out, we don't have Canadian-owned steel industry. The Hamilton facility is owned by an American company. The American owner has actually supported Trump tariffs against Canadian steel for the purpose of supporting that owner's American steel facilities. So there's a clear conflict of interest here. I'm going to turn to Bill now and just ask you for your reflections on how American industry I know you're a big critic of the corporate ethos in the United States, but they are adjusting. American business is adjusting in a unique way to Trump's approach, and they're making the most out of it, partly for personal benefit, but also to attract new investment into the country. How real is this? To what extent is it really going to hurt Canadian industry? Because they are Canadian companies who, out of the need for survival, are maybe thinking about relocating south of the border simply to maintain their businesses. Give us a perspective from south of the border.
Yeah, well, first of all, I agree. There's no shortage of finance. There's no shortage of technological opportunity. The players have to put it together. I argue you don't just need policy. You need the business enterprises that have the expertise to go along with it. And any company that I've studied, and the ones I mentioned, they are full of expertise. It's not a matter of they don't have the capability. It's that the people who are running those companies aren't pulling it together and often chase the good people away. Okay, but now I'd see first of all, what's going on under the Trump administration is just a bunch of cowardice, a lack of perspective, business billionaires. I mean, you saw them on the dais with Trump at the inauguration. I think that will live in infamy, that picture of Bezos and the others, because these people have so much power and they go to someone who they know is basically a moron. I mean, there's no doubt. And the policies are moronic. They have no consistency. So people have asked me to comment on them. What are you going to comment on? Because you don't know what's going to come tomorrow. The bigger problem for me, or a big problem that needs to be addressed, particularly since we're at a university, which is co-sponsoring this, is the nonsense that comes out of economics department. So several years ago, when I was teaching an introductory economics course, I hadn't done it in a long, long time, I went back and looked at the textbook that I used in my very first course at the University of Toronto, Paul Samuelson's economics textbook. And if anybody's interested in the articles, I have a few articles on this and some lectures. What you are taught and what millions and millions of students are taught today in introductory economics courses and carries with them insofar as they understand economics later on is that the most unproductive firm is the foundation of the most efficient economy. Anytime you hear someone talking about the problems, market imperfections, market failures, you know they don't know what's going on in the economy. It's organizations that determine what happens in the economy. Households as organizations, government agencies as organizations, business corporations as organizations, civil society organizations that lie with them. And the way the economy works, in fact, is a way in which you have to control market forces, not be subjected to them in order to be successful, in order to have what I call sustainable prosperity. Progressive value creation is an understanding of that reality, and it's a challenge to what I call the myth of the market economy. And the arguments that are made for the kinds of policies that just enrich the people at the top and immiserate everybody else, they are based on the myth of the market economy. And I'm sorry, not even progressive economists, since I use the term progressive, like Joseph Stiglitz or Paul Krugman, confront that issue. They buy into this myth of the market economy, a totally bankrupt microeconomics. And so that affects the policy changes, the policy conversations, I should say. Now, I should say that, at least in the US, I haven't had much of these conversations in Canada, but in the US, I've had a lot of progress in getting politicians to recognize the problem of corporate financialization, including people like Joe Biden and Elizabeth Warren, Senator Tammy Baldwin, another senator. There's even legislation in Congress on this. But as soon as they realize the implications of it, or as in Biden's case, get into power where they can actually do something about it, they run away from it. And they will just not address these issues. And I think this is a huge problem right now in US politics from the Democratic side. I don't know if any of you have read this book, which I think is quite insidious, is the last thing I'll say. Abundance by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson. One of the things they say in there, which just gives it all away, they never talk about inequality in the whole book. Okay, one thing they say, just in passing and laying out the scenario for the future where we actually solve all the problems by getting rid of government regulation, is that everybody contributes to AI, so everyone will profit from it. That's incredible. You just need to look what's going on day by day today to know that's not true.
Yeah. Well, look, I think what's more dangerous than a free market dogmatic economist is a free market dogmatic politician who doesn't understand economics, and we've got a lot of those. But I mean, we live in a market economy, and one of the big questions that Canada has to face in terms of its decarbonization strategy is the whole issue of EVs and how we promote the use of EVs, whether through domestic production, industrial strategy, through imports, which part of supply chain do we want to get involved in? Do we use the market, as the mechanism? Or do we intervene massively? We've got an EV mandate, as you know, which a lot of people are unhappy with, particularly my friends in the auto industry in Ontario. Dan, start us off on this question.
I think the first thing to recognize, and I think, Bentley, you made this point, is that EVs are actually just better. From a consumer perspective, they're just better vehicles for getting around in. They're a nicer drive, and they'll save you a hell of a lot of money on fuel costs. So I think, the direction of travel is clear. The world is going to electrify vehicles. Even all of the North American automakers who are complaining about EV mandates, they're all doubling down on those investments. Part of this is it's a question of timing, and it's a question of who are going to be the winners and losers amongst automakers. And there's a lot of consternation in North America and in Europe that they're being supplanted by the Chinese, who are now making the best, cheapest cars in the world, and they happen to be electric. So I think we don't have these kinds of conversations in Canada about these trade-offs. So right now we've got, we've had a lot of public dollars, to Bentley's point, that have gone into trying to stand up battery supply chain and to hopefully support some EV assembly in Canada. That can be great for the economy in those parts of the country where there's going to be investment and there are going to be jobs created. If at the same time we're imposing 100% tariffs on Chinese-made EVs, we're doing a disservice to Canadian consumers, because right now it is hard to find a cheaper EV. So I think we're going to have to weave together some of these different conversations around affordability, around what are some of the priority opportunities for our economy and where we want investment. Who are we trading with? These things have to be woven together as opposed to living in their individual silos and never really intersecting when it comes to policymaking, the government ministries that are responsible for it, or the conversation that we all have as Canadians.
What would you do? Let's get off the fence here. Come on. Like, what would you do in order to help us transition to the vehicle of the future? I mean, it's the one that's cheaper, it's better for the economy, it's a better drive. That's what you're arguing. You're not talking about politics and so on. How would we get there?
Okay, I think there are several things. I think we need to keep the the supply mandate that we have, it is providing certainty to the marketplace to drive investment, both in supply, but not just the supply of electric vehicles. You talk to any of the companies that are providing EV charging, and they look to that supply mandate and they said, that gives us line of sight on how fast to build out EV charging. And we can go to banks and we can have bankable projects because we have that policy providing certainty about how that market is going to evolve and how demand for EV charging is going to evolve. So it plays a really important role in sending that signal. Do we need to make it a little bit less aggressive? Sure. For those people who really react to the fact that right now it leads to a prohibition on gas cars, get rid of the prohibition. Take it to 90% and let the market take it the rest of the way.
And tariffs?
So on tariffs, I think two things. One is right now, to protect the North American auto sector, we have North American safety standards. The rest of the world follows a single set of standards that are different than what we use in North America. And we use that difference in standards to limit what vehicles can come into the Canadian market. If we were to accept, as Mexico does, both the North American standard and the international standard for safety, all of a sudden we would have more choice in terms of different models, different price points, different sizes of EVs that are made in Europe, that are made in Korea, Japan, China. And on tariffs, I would say, I would negotiate with the Chinese and I would say, we're interested in having Chinese EV technology in Canada. We'd like to have some investment in manufacturing those vehicles in Canada in the exact same way that we approached Toyota and Honda when they had more fuel efficient vehicles than were being produced in North America. We didn't want to buy them from them if they were manufacturing them and exporting them. So we convinced them to it and we allowed them and enabled them to invest in production in Canada.
Super. Bentley, what do you think? And I'm going to ask people who have questions to please start lining up. We probably can only take 3 or 4 questions. I am going to take liberties to extend our session to 12:50 because we started 10 minutes late. If that's all right with the organizers. I'm getting the evil eye. Maybe 12:45 then, if that's okay. So Bentley, and then we'll take a couple of questions.
Yeah, just on that, I mean, I completely agree that that we should keep the mandate in place, but I do think you can reform the credit system that underlies the mandate. The interesting thing about that mandate system is that it was pioneered in California, and then guess who copied it? China. But when China did it, it calibrated the way that they allocated the credits to support domestic manufacturers. And Tesla and the domestic manufacturers both benefited from the credit system, but Tesla was kept there explicitly as what is called actually in China as a catfish, which is a company that is there to discipline the domestic firms, which is to say it shows the domestic firms what the technological frontier looks like. And then basically now we're at the point at which the Chinese firms are as good as Tesla. I don't expect Tesla to last long in the Chinese market at this point. Now, I'm not saying we should copy that approach, but this is taking a strategic approach to using a market-based mechanism that has a clear industrial strategy goal, right? And that's what we're actually missing in the current context in Canada. We're doing a lot of things, and I don't mean to come off quite as acerbic as I'm coming off, because actually I think we're doing a lot of good things in a lot of different areas in Canadian industrial strategy. But what is missing is this kind of tying of things together, right? And leaving programs as important as the EV mandate credit just on autopilot, right? That we're not actually calibrating that for our industrial strategy. The same thing when we subsidized medium and heavy duty vehicles through the MHZEV program that the federal government had. Again, here was an opportunity because we actually have OEMs, original equipment manufacturers, someone that actually produces the vehicles of medium and heavy duty trucks and vehicles in this country. New Flyer, the Prime Minister was there at their facility. Nova Bus. We actually make those in this country, but we didn't tweak our own credit program to favor Canadian firms, right? We allowed foreign firms to get the same benefit as Canadian firms when we did that credit. So we've got all of these programs out there that are just really easy to make simple tweaks to that would create demand pull on Canadian manufacturing, and we're just not using those tweaks. And those are non-fiscal levers for creating demand for Canadian goods, and there's a ton of them across the economy that we're just not taking advantage of. And so that goes back to the finance conversation. In some of these cases, we don't need new finance. We just need to stimulate internal demand through the appropriate use of the regulatory levers that we're already deploying for climate reasons. We're just not also deploying them for industrial strategy reasons. So that's what I mean when I say we've got win-wins lying around everywhere, because we've done a lot of good things, but we need to start tying those things together into a strategic approach and taking that broad view. I don't know, I feel like people just feel like it's un-Canadian or something like that, like to set a target and be accountable for it and actually try to achieve that target through a strategic approach. Like this is something we can do and we can do it well. We just need to get to work on it.
Okay, keep the mandate, but stitch it together with a strategic approach to industrial policy that uses the existing programs and financing to create domestic industry. That's basically the answer. Terrific. I think my
Content. We're sending too much content south of the border, and that gets to the trade diversification problem. If you look at our exports, number one, oil and gas, number two, automotive, $90 billion a year, most of which is going to the United States, right? So, but the thing is, in oil and gas, we run a trade deficit with the United States, right? Like they buy a lot more than we buy from them. But in automotive, it's basically 1 for 1. So for every dollar we export, we import $1 across that border, right? So a good way to increase your exports is just start doing some displacement of those imports on the automotive side and increase the Canadian content that is being purchased on the Canadian side of the border. And this is something that actually that Prime Minister Carney campaigned on. He said we were going to have an all-in Canada industrial strategy for automotive. He didn't call it EVs at that point, but any way of separating yourself from American policy at this point will push you in the direction of EVs, I think. But that hasn't come back now. And I think your point on the projects is important, but we're coming to this period now in the fall where we have to get back to actually having a strategy, not just doing projects that could end up being less than the sum of their parts, but actually having a strategy.
Dan?
I just want to flag one thing that, and we're not going to solve it on this panel or in this room or over lunch, but one of the real challenges too is the extent to which these issues have become politicized and polarized. And anything right now that in any way is tied to climate has become not looking at, we don't have opposition politicians saying, I want to achieve the same outcome and I'm going to do it in a different or better way. They're saying anything you can do, I can get rid of. And we hear that from folks in the business community who say they need certainty and predictability. And one of the challenges we have right now with the political cycle and the polarization is that we're not necessarily allowing ourselves the patience to see some of these policies, whether it's industrial policy or whether it's climate policy, come to fruition. The federal EV availability standard is not even yet in force, and Pierre Poilievre can't wait to get rid of it, right? And the automakers can't wait to get rid of it. So, we have to have a little bit more patience. I'm not sure what the solution is to enable that, but it's going to continue to hamper us if we can't keep things in place for long enough for them to work.
Terrific. I'm going to just take 2 questions. If there's time, we'll take more and see if our panelists will respond to them collectively. First, I'll start with my colleague. Please introduce yourself.
Yes, hello. My name is Rosa Galvez. I'm an independent senator like my colleague, Pao Wu. And so he's right, the discussion in Ottawa is not about Canada becoming an electro state. It's more like how can we keep being a petro state? So the conversation was a lot on the geopolitics and the economic, but I know there is a lot of things too in the technological and environmental, in the social, in the health. I came from Bogota, where I learned that 1 barrel of petroleum produces $175 of damage for the environment and for the health. So we sell our petroleum, I don't know, as low as $24 or as high as 60, but it will never be $100 a barrel anymore. So we are causing a lot of damage. So my question is, who should pay for this industrial strategy? And I will be happy to be lobbied by you guys, because I used to be the highest lobbyist in the Senate, but it was mostly from the lawyers of the oil and gas that produces, all a lot of disruptions. And so it is interesting that when I go away and I am in the global south, they say how the pension plans of Canada are the wealthiest and they are investing in renewable energy in these countries. But when I come back home, I don't see them investing. So who should invest in this? We talk about changing the cash flow, And I would like you to touch the issue on the subsidies, because it is true that we have to manage decline. And I want you to tell me the billions that we pay per year, what it signifies for the oil and gas sector. I being said that is the amount that they pay in human resources. So if we are paying to have jobs in the oil and gas sector, we can pay to have jobs in another sector. So thank you so much for your answer.
Thank you, Rosa. This side, please, if you'd introduce yourself and ask your
Sure,
question.
thank you. My name is Heather Lynn Ramackle. I'm representing the artist mindset here today. So I am partnered with my husband in a project, we call it the Decades After Paris Music Project, Paris referencing the Climate 21, or the COP21 climate talks. And this question actually hurts my heart a little bit. I'm a happy EV owner, although I did take the bus today. And as an EV owner, I've become anxious about travel upon BC ferries, for example, because now I'm told that I'm unable to have a broken down EV travel on a ferry. But also I think about the very visceral images from the LA fire, and represented in those images is an unprecedented toxic problem with our burned EV batteries. And so I'm really conflicted on this, because if we're thinking about the future and our industrial economy, and we're also, as I think, Dan, you mentioned, like weaving these conversations together, including from this morning, how are we preparing our policy and our investors in these industries who will eventually be held accountable for the onslaught of wildfires that cause these toxic damages? So really curious to know, is that in the conversation right now?
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask our panelists to respond. The questions are connected, right? It's really about corporate responsibility and the extent of subsidies that are going to oil and gas, and the unaccounted for costs, downstream costs of oil and gas and other industries that are not being properly compensated for. So maybe, Bill, you can start.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is part of the problem, that business has adopted what's suitable for them and not what's suitable for everybody else. It needn't have been that way. So recently, I've been looking at the history of the rise of shareholder value ideology in the United States. And I was there at Harvard Business School when they hired a guy named Michael Jensen in 1985. And then I saw it, really come in and take hold. So there was one person who really pushed corporations towards shareholder value, Ralph Nader. He had the impact of Ralph Nader in getting Clean Air Act, getting all kinds of legislation, just drove business crazy. It led to Milton Friedman writing his famous article in 1970, which was in the context of GM trying to put public interest people on the board of General Motors. It drove a guy named Lewis Powell, who became the Chief Justice. I know people in Canada have heard of the Powell memo. It's quite well known. It was just a screed against the left, and Ralph Nader was right in the middle. And part of the reason Ralph Nader was there was he was not. Actually, I was a leftist student in the early 1970s. Ralph Nader was, I saw him more to the right, but he was effective. And there was a response of American business to that effectiveness that said, we're going to get rid of all this. And it ended up becoming, basically now Project 2025, but it was a long time building. But basically it was something that a company like General Motors knew that it had to produce cleaner and safer cars once Ralph Nader attacked them. And they tried to do it. For example, they shifted quite unexpectedly from leaded to unleaded gas. In 1970, they announced that they would no longer produce lead gas vehicles. And that was because of environmental activism. But they organized in opposition to environmental acts. And every time you had the California Cafe standards, they found someone to put in office to get rid of them.
Action, reaction. Bentley?
Yeah, I want to respond maybe more to the spirit of the question rather than the content of it, which is that when I hear anxiety about the potential environmental damage that the energy transition itself is going to cause, I go back to the macro perspective, the big global perspective, right? Which is, what is the most mined material in the world today? It's not nickel for electric batteries. It's not copper for electric lines. It's oil and gas. That's the #1 product that creates environmental destruction in this world. And if you can start to eliminate the footprint that oil and gas has on planet Earth, you are having a net good, right? And it's okay if there's a little bit of toxic battery sludge in the LA fires, because we've eliminated huge swaths of forest and land that has been destroyed by coal and oil and gas mining. That's okay. We can feel good about that transition regardless of the negative consequences that we see in the present, right? And I think that we have an opportunity in Canada. Again, we came up with this like beautiful idea, right? Because we were listening to the economists who love beautiful ideas. Which is that we were going to be able to take all of those environmental externalities that we were creating from our fossil fuel system, and we're going to roll them into a carbon price, and we were going to use that carbon price to move our national emissions up and down like it was on a lever. And that was a fantasy. That was a fantasy which put too much faith in the models that we have of emissions, right? And it was a fantasy that climate change was a technocratic problem that could be solved by policy that didn't make us break eggs. But we have to break some eggs. At the end of the day, getting rid of the oil and gas industry globally, it's a form of war. And we need to have weapons on the clean energy side, right? And those weapons look like mining copper, mining nickel, because that builds economic interest in rural communities in this province and in other provinces in this country that need to see themselves as having a role in the net zero future. It creates corporate interests, which I agree they shouldn't be as strong as they are, but guess what? They're really strong. And so you need them on your side if you want deep decarbonization to happen in this world, right? And so industrial strategy is about flipping all of that and saying, actually, instead of worrying about incremental emissions reductions that come out of a model, we're going to think about the systems that we have in this society, and we're going to take a structural transformation approach to those systems. And that's the approach that we really pioneered at the Transition Accelerator 7 years ago now. And if you want to hear more about how we can use structural transformation to change climate policy in this country, then check out the work of the Transition Accelerator, because that's what we're trying to do. We're not worried about little megaton here, megaton there, right? We're going to transform the transportation system, and the transformation of the transportation system is going to reduce demand for oil and gas, and that's the way it is.
Okay, Dan, last word to you.
I think the only thing I would build on Bentley's comments is, I think the first iteration, let's call it Climate Policy 1.0, was future emissions target driven backcasting using models that we've over-indexed on and that have a false level of precision to then develop not just carbon pricing, but any number of regulatory levers. And it works to an extent. But I think to his point, it is challenged by the politics, right? And policy is forged in the crucible of politics. And so I think what we're hearing from, particularly those politicians and those volunteers who go out and knock on doors, is that we do need to calibrate some of this to the lived experience. And so I don't think it's just about technological transformation. To Heather's comment, I think this is about transformation more broadly. So when I think about transportation, I don't just think about how can we get everybody into EVs. I think, how can we get people out of cars? How can we have them living in communities where they don't need to necessarily experience car ownership and all the costs that come with it, even if it's an EV. So what are we thinking about in terms of how we get around? But these are the kinds of transformation conversations that we need to have, and they happen in the technological realm, they happen in the social realm, and they also have to happen in the political realm.
That's a great way to end a session on transformation. Please join me in thanking our panelists.
And thank you very much to the panel. I was just thinking, good luck crossing the border. Wish you well. You're very brave, but there is, as I said earlier, in a more serious tone, that some of the comments that we heard yesterday, and it just came home right now, that somebody said it, there is power in words, and your words this morning were quite powerful, and we enjoyed it. Now, I have some very simple things to say before we have lunch. The 30 people are online. We've captured your comments and they will be in our report. Another very important thing, I was reminded by somebody moments ago that the paper cups that you have around you that might be here in terms of our own environment, could you please take them to one of those 6 baskets that have 7 ideas of where you put each one into each one, which is very difficult because the slots are very small, but it'd be very, very helpful to do that. And my other notes were just has to do with lunch. It's inside the David Strong building, and our volunteers will show you there. So thank you, Senator, very much. Good to see you again on this panel, all panels this morning. Boy, if there's ever a test, thank you very much.